I want to turn this evening to a question asked by Jesus in St. Luke chapter 23 and verse 41. And these are almost the final words that he spoke prior to his crucifixion. And the question he asked was this: if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? If they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? Amongst the multitude who accompanied Jesus to his place of execution, there were a group of women. And these women wailed and wept as they saw Jesus. And that isn't surprising. You would have to be hard-hearted to see a man wearing a crown of thorns, bruised by the severity of his scourging, so weak, so exhausted that he cannot bear his own cross. You'd have to be hard-hearted to see such a scene and not be moved, not be stirred. And yet what does Jesus say to these women? Verse 28. Jesus, turning to them, said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." Now, he wasn't rebuking them for their tears. After all, here were a group of women, and in contrast to the hostile crowd, in contrast to the cruel Roman soldiers, they were expressing their sympathy. They were showing their humanity. And so Jesus was not rebuking them, but he was warning them. He was preparing them for something which was to come upon them, upon their children, upon Jerusalem, upon the entire nation of Israel. He was warning about coming judgment, impending disaster. If they do these things, he says, in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? What did Jesus mean? Well, Jesus here describes himself as being a green wood or a green tree. In other words, he was a fruitful tree, full of vitality. He was thriving. He was prospering. He was all that a tree should be. And yet even he, a green tree, he was now being devoured by the flames of opposition, by the fires of persecution. Well, he says, if this is happening to a green tree, what will happen to trees that are dead and dry and unfruitful? If a green tree crackles in the flames, how much more will a dry, a dead tree, a tree that is rotten to the core, how much will that tree be devoured and destroyed by the heat of the fire? Now, there is to his words an immediate, specific interpretation, but also a future, more general interpretation. First of all, the immediate, specific interpretation. Jesus had not rebelled against the Romans. He'd not provoked them. He'd rendered to Caesar the things that were Caesar's. And even Pilate, the Roman governor, had to acknowledge this. Verse 4, I find no fault in this man. Verse 14, I have found no fault in this man. Verse 22, I have found no reason for death in him. Jesus was innocent. He was perfect. He was not guilty. He was the green tree. But that was not sufficient. Not sufficient to stop the Romans, their rulers, their soldiers. Not sufficient to stop them scourging one who was perfect, crucifying one who was innocent. Well, says Jesus, if they're doing that to me, what about the Jewish nation? What about Jerusalem? If they're doing this to one who has not rebelled, whatever will they do to the nation that has rebelled? If they do this to a green tree, what will they do to a dead tree? Now in verses 29 and 30, Jesus goes on to describe the destruction of Jerusalem in two proverbial sayings. Indeed, the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. In those days, there were two things that people dreaded more than anything else. First, not being able to have children. And two, being buried alive. These were two things that people feared the most. And those fears, to a greater or lesser extent, still exist today. In January, in the United States, a grandmother gave birth to her granddaughter. And whatever we might think about the medical ethics, it does indicate how much her daughter wanted a baby. This fear, this dread of not being able to have a child. And also the fear of being buried alive. There's a name for it. It's taphophobia. And of course, before the advent of modern medicine, it was not an irrational fear. George Washington, on his deathbed, requested that nothing be done to his body until 2 or 3 days after he died. He had taphophobia. These were things which still today people have a dread of, and they were things that people dreaded even more at the time of Jesus. But Jesus says, when the siege, when the destruction of Jerusalem comes, those who've never had children will rejoice. And those who have been buried alive will be thankful. The horror will be such that they will say, what a blessing! What a blessing that children did not see this day. What a blessing to be buried alive and not to witness the devastation, the destruction of our city. That will be the response. The attitude of the people. Because if the Romans are doing this to a green tree, they will not spare. They will not spare a tree that is dry and dead and rotten. Well, the words of Jesus were prophetic, and they were fulfilled in AD 70. Jerusalem was ransacked by the Romans. The temple was destroyed. And Josephus, the Roman historian, estimates that over 1 million people were killed. 97,000 were captured. He writes, men and women, old and young, insurgents and priests, those who fought and those who entreated mercy, they were all hewn down in indiscriminate carnage. The Romans had to clamber over heaps of bodies to carry out their work of extermination. The words of Jesus were to be fulfilled. And that's why he says, daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. Well, that's the immediate, the specific interpretation. But for us tonight, there's a more general interpretation. You see, in the eyes of God, Jesus was the green tree. He knew no sin. He did no sin. Tempted in all points as we are, and yet without sin. He was the green tree. Indeed, 3 times from his pulpit in heaven, God spoke to this earth. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Jesus was the green tree. And yet, though he was the apple of his Father's eye, he was smitten, stricken, afflicted by God. Though he'd always done those things that were pleasing to his Father, nevertheless, as he hung upon the cross, God abandoned him. God turned his back upon him. That was how God dealt with the green tree. That's how he dealt with his only begotten Son. Well, you and I, we are not green trees. On the contrary, by nature, we are trees that are dry and dead and rotten. What did David say? I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Our youngest granddaughter has just spoken her first 2 words. I don't mean mummy and daddy, I mean her first 2 proper words. And they are very significant. She holds a toy in her hand, and when her brother and sister come towards her, she says, mine, mine. But then when her brother and sister are holding a toy in their hands, she goes to them and she says, share, share. Oh, when they come to her, There's no share. It's mine. But when she goes to them, she expects them to share. Now, I'm quite sure that when she was 6 months or 12 months old, her parents didn't sit her down and say, we're going to teach you how to be selfish. We're going to teach you how to be covetous. No, it's not that way at all. It's there by nature. We call it original sin. Shapen in iniquity, in sin did my mother conceive me. What did Peter say? Depart from me. I am a sinful man, O Lord. What did Paul say? O wretched man that I am, in me there dwells no good thing. This isn't what others said about them. It's what they said about themselves. They knew they were not green trees. They knew themselves to be trees that were dry and dead and rotten. I was thinking the other day, there are many things that we don't understand as Christians. But there's one thing, perhaps more than any other, and it's this. Not one of us knows just how sinful we are. You all know that I am a sinner. My wife knows better than you know that I am a sinner. I know better than she knows that I am a sinner. But the only one who knows just how sinful I am is God himself. All things are naked and open to the eyes of him with whom we have to do. Jesus was the green tree without sin. We are the dry trees, spoilt and corrupted by sin. Well, this brings us to the mystery and to the challenge of Calvary. As we approach another Easter time, it sets before us the mystery of Calvary. I think I've shared this with some of you before, but I remember some time ago, Pat and I were in a shopping arcade, and Pat said what she often says on such occasions, can we go for a cup of coffee? Well, we were on the ground floor, and the coffee shop was on the first floor. And so I do what I always do on these occasions. I always use the stairs. I'm sure the doctor would tell us it's far healthier to use the stairs. And so I always use the stairs, and I put Aaron and Pat into the lift. But on this occasion, the lift broke down between the first and the ground floor. And just for a few moments, Pat and Aaron were in that very uncomfortable position. They weren't on the first floor, they weren't on the ground floor, they were suspended somewhere in between. Now, when Jesus Christ was crucified upon the cross, he was raised from this earth. He was suspended between heaven and earth. And that signified something. It signified that this earth did not want him, and that heaven would not have him. Now, to some extent, I can understand why this earth didn't want him. His purity, his perfection. It exposed the sin, the corruption of men. I can see why this earth did not want him. But why would heaven not have him? Why did God, his Father, turn his back upon him? Turn his back on the green tree, on the very apple of his eye? Why did God, in a sense, do what Pontius Pilate did? Declare Jesus to be innocent and then abandon him to a fearful death upon the cross. Why? Well, there's only one answer. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. Christ bore my sin in his own body on the tree. God made him to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. That's the answer. Jesus was not being punished for his own sin. He had none. He was the green tree. He was being punished for my sin. Being punished for your sin. And that's the meaning. That's the mystery of Calvary. Died he for me, who caused his pain, for me who him to death pursued. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? That's the mystery. But the challenge is this. We're in days when many people deny that they are sinners. Or if they don't, they tell us that sin is something trivial, something man will never be punished for. But my question is this. If God punished the green tree, what makes us think he will just ignore, just wink at the sins of the dry trees? If God had said, I can't punish my son, I can't punish my son, even though he's bearing the sins of others, if God had said that, we might have grounds for thinking he won't punish my sin. But God didn't do that. He made no exception for his own son. And therefore, he will make no exception for anyone. Sin must, sin will be punished. And so the question is this. Has my sin already been punished in Christ? Or on the day of judgment, will I have to bear the punishment myself? Those are the two alternatives. Those are the two options. I either shelter in Christ, trust in Christ, and his sacrifice covers my sin, or else one day I will stand before God exposed, and I will be punished for my sin. Those are the two options, the two alternatives. I'm sure you've heard this illustration before. How a fire burnt down the barn of a farmer. And afterwards, as the embers cooled, the farmer was inspecting the ruins and he came across the scorched body of the mother hen. He turned the body over, and then to his great surprise, 3 chicks chirped and ran across the floor. The fire had fallen on the hen, but the chicks had been saved. And that's the wonderful, the amazing message of the gospel. 2,000 years ago, the fire fell. The fire of God's judgment fell on Christ at Calvary. And if we trust in him, if we shelter in him, then we are not condemned. We are spared. We are saved because the fire of God's judgment has fallen on Christ. But if we reject him, if we spurn him, then one day the fire, the judgment will fall on us. For be sure of this, if God punished his son, the green tree, he will most certainly punish unrepentant sinners, the dry trees. I urge you, in the presence of God tonight, to examine your own heart and to ask yourself, am I saved? Am I trusting in Christ? Am I sheltered under his sacrificial death upon Calvary's tree? Or have I rejected him? Have I never accepted him? Am I heading for that day when I shall stand at the judgment seat and I will have to accept that punishment which Jesus warned against, that punishment which will be the fate of all unrepentant sinners? I urge you tonight, if you've never done so, this is still the day of grace. It's not the day of judgment yet. This is still the day of grace. If you've never done so, turn from sin. Trust in Christ. Receive him tonight. Be saved for time and for eternity. And say with the hymn writer, no condemnation, now I dread. Jesus and all in him is mine, alive in him my risen head, and clothed with righteousness divine. Bold I approach the eternal throne, and claim the crown through Christ my own. For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry?